Welcome everybody. As you will have picked up from the kind of headline of the session, we're going to do a really deep dive today into how brands, particularly B2B brands, can influence the way that AI presents you to all of your different customers. We did a very, very big research study fairly recently, which kind of sits beneath all of this. It does challenge quite a lot of the kind of existing ideas that are out there around AEO. So I'll walk you through some of the research for that. So just in terms of what we're going to cover, I want to make sure that today is really actionable and that you walk away with stuff that you can implement, like certainly over the next 6 months, but also some stuff that you can potentially do tomorrow that's going to really help. So I want to spend most of the time on there. I am going to walk you through some of the research and context, just so that you understand where those recommendations and where that strategy, the strategy that we're proposing here, kind of what sits at the heart of it. But as I say, I want to spend most of the time on these later bits. I guess to set the scene a little bit, one of our biggest theses as a company, or part of our reason for existing at Demand Genius, is that we think that AI is a very, very fundamental shift. And very definitely not just an evolution of search. And I'm going to cover that a little bit more because I think it's really important to understand. They're very different things. So 89% of B2B customers now use Gen AI during the purchasing process. And they don't just use that at the top of the funnel, right? So where search was a directory, it was really designed to link to your site. AI isn't. It acts as a trusted advisor. So if you have an enterprise buying group of 11 people, each one of them, throughout every step of their journey, from problem awareness through to ultimately selecting a solution, is going to be going back and forth with AI in a whole range of conversations at every stage. So it's not a directory, it's an awful lot more than that. And I think that's important when we think about how to optimize it. Is it's not just somewhere that we want to be visible. It's not just a source of traffic that we then have to convert. It's much more like an active participant. Think of it as a channel partner or a consultant that you really need to enable on who you are, who you're for, and kind of learn to sell through rather than just use it as treat as a way to reach people. And I think that's really important context. And that was what underlined a lot of the research we decided to do, is we wanted to understand better how AI performs that function. We think the kind of search element of what AI does is very well understood and well covered. But for B2B brands, we know there's an awful lot more. I'm not going to take you through every element of our research, but I think there are a few key insights that I want to run through, just to make sure that we give you a grounding in that. So the first one is that AI very rarely searches for answers. And that's really important to understand about how it works. And there's a few things at the heart of this. For context, the study that we did recently, we ran an awful lot of prompts across. And our goal was to understand how responses vary at every stage of a complex B2B buyer journey. So if we run a prompt at awareness, consideration, conversion stages, how does the response that we get back differ? And we ran that across, I think it was 14 different B2B categories, hundreds, thousands of prompts. We noticed a few things. So I'm not going to cover every one of these in loads of detail. We did do a webinar a few weeks ago where we really got stuck into the research findings. And I'll share the slides with you after so you can go through this. But I think what's really interesting and relevant for this conversation is this bit here, which is how often does AI actually invoke retrieval, go searching for information? At awareness, 0% of the time. At consideration, 0% of the time. Only once you get to conversion-oriented queries does AI ever actually conduct any research. Does it go looking for answers? Generally speaking, when there is some level of uncertainty there. Which has obviously really big implications for how we approach it as a channel. And actually, I think about how we think about marketing and organic acquisition, I should say, as a whole, because the funnel is obviously the kind of typical framework that we use. But the funnel is only useful for so long as you can find people at every stage of it, right? So whereas in the world of search, at every stage, whether your query that you put into Google is explorative, evaluative, comparative, it's going to direct people to you, right? That's literally what it's designed to do. It's going to link people to your site. And the challenge is then, how do we detect, okay, where is this individual in their journey? Where do they sit within the funnel? How do we treat them in the right way that's going to help move them through there and ultimately get them to buy our product? Now it's very different. In all of these stages, they don't actually come to your site. They only arrive on your site right at the end when they start entering these conversion-focused queries. And then suddenly, just going back to this, suddenly it goes looking for answers, suddenly citations appear, and there's a mechanism for that person to actually land on your site. So we can be very doom and gloom about that. I think it has a very big impact on the way that we go about optimizing. I actually think it's a fantastic thing. Buyers arrive educated, which can only be a good thing, right? You're getting traffic to your site that is relevant, educated, and kind of ready to be converted. But it does mean that a lot of their buying criteria has already been set. So obviously we know that particularly in a complex category, a huge amount of the challenge doesn't live in the conversion stage, right? A huge amount of the challenge actually is about how we help that individual frame the problem, build a requirements list, build their shortlist in such a way as actually means that we're going to end up being the chosen vendor. So as long as we're looking at AEO as just about visibility, about gaining citations that get traffic, we're really seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's just those conversion-oriented prompts that we're optimizing for, whereas the bulk of the challenge actually sits beneath the surface. And to illustrate this, what I think is really useful is just to use a couple of examples. So I like to take three categories that you might that your typical CFO, for example, is going to purchase. Toothpaste, very transactional, very much commoditized. The decision over which toothpaste to buy is largely driven by which toothpaste is on offer, what price considerations. Very, very little awareness and consideration stage there. So everything that I'm about to tell you, not that relevant, because for them it is about optimizing visibility at the point of transaction. As we get more and more complicated, we go into trainers. Okay, well, now there's an awful lot more. Do you run? How environmentally friendly are you? Do you have back problems? How far do you run? What other kinds of exercise do you do? That's all information that needs to be gathered, and actually is your answers to those questions is going to define your choice a lot more than just which one you saw an ad for right at the end. So again, more and more of the job to do with AI is actually about how we frame those requirements and how we communicate to AI how we fit all of those different requirements and criteria that different buyers are going to impose. As we then get a step more complicated and we get into kind of B2B world and someone wants to rip out a bidding system and put in a new one, suddenly we have so much more. We have 6, 12, 18 months of problem framing and requirement building. And sure, AI is helping them go through that faster, but that's the key. They're now going through that process, not with you every step of the way, but with AI. So your job now becomes how do we influence problem framing and requirement building through the individual. And when you add in the fact that there's probably 13 different stakeholders, each independently going through that process, you now need to really make sure that you understand how AI is positioning both your category and your product at every stage of that, not just whether when they search best billing provider, you come up. So that's one thing that I think is really important to understand about how AI works conceptually. The other thing is, even when it does go searching, it doesn't actually search. So there's a thing that's really important to understand about how AI operates under the hood called query fan out. And that's basically in that 48% of instances where AI does go looking for an answer, they don't search the original prompt. So when we think about optimizing for AI, and we think about, okay, let's look at this prompt, let's track how we show up in those answers, that's not what actually happens under the hood. The prompt the user puts in isn't the thing that the AI searches for an answer to. What it actually does is it breaks down that prompt, what's the best AEO platform for B2B brands, into typically around 20 subqueries based on specific gaps in its knowledge that it needs to go and answer. So what is AEO? Looks at reviews. What's the difference between AEO and B2C? Why is this criteria being imposed there? There's going to be a whole kind of fan out, literally, of queries that it goes and runs, and it gathers the response, and it collects that into its knowledge, and it uses that to compile an answer. So when Google provides an AI overview, when ChatGPT gives you a response, that's what's actually happening under the hood. So most of AEO and SEO strategy, and unfortunately, a lot of what people are doing in the AEO world is built on SEO principles, I would argue falsely. It assumes a direct connection between the answer and the question in a very search, in the sense that that's what gets searched for. And that's not actually what happens under the hood. So even when it does go to retrieve and it does go looking for an answer, it doesn't search. And then finally, even if it did, one thing I did a bit of kind of napkin math. So there's some very fundamental differences between a prompt and a keyword. So one thing that's quite interesting is to look at an example. So let's take a keyword for best CRM solutions, right? So keywords by nature are very straightforward, they're concise, they force a user, they put the burden on the user to consolidate all of their questions and really think about how can I make that into a concise keyword. And as search has got more intelligent, it's been a clear trend that keywords have got longer and more complicated. And think of AI as basically taking that to a new extreme, to the point that now a prompt looks totally different. It's verbose, it applies criteria such as the job role, company profile, tech stack, buying group, different use cases that they have, which makes it pretty much impossible to optimize for each one of these individually. Because when you extrapolate all of those different criteria that can be applied, the different job roles that someone might apply to that, the different personas that they might embody, even before you consider the conversational context, that leads you to 22,500 different variations of prompts that can be drawn from just that one keyword, which was best CRM solution. So you can see, if we're got a fun GIF here, you can see it's very, very difficult to go and optimize for that in the kind of way that we traditionally have, because you would need to create 22,500 pieces of content, and that's obviously not realistic to maintain, no matter how aggressively you want to have ChatGPT churning out blog posts for you. So that's another thing that I think is really important to understand, and it leads into why we think our research has shown that visibility is not really the right goal from AI. Influence is what we want to do. We want to influence all of those invisible conversations, the invisible interactions that don't show up in a small number of prompts that we might choose to track, where problems are framed, requirements are built, and that's ultimately where a complex category is going to be won and lost. And that requires thinking in a very different way and framing the problem in a very different way that is much less kind of search related. I'm going to pause because I think that before we get into kind of how we go about doing that, John, I don't know if you haven't had any questions. I'm conscious I'm talking a lot.
No questions in yet. If you've got any questions, guys, do feel free to put them in the chat.
No.
Otherwise, crack on.
Cool. So yeah, if AI doesn't search, then how do we go and influence AI search? And actually, one of my resolutions for the rest of this year is to stop calling it AI search. But I need to think of a nice pithy name. There's a few things that we've learned here. The biggest thing that I'm going to go through is like the levers that we have at our disposal to actually influence what AI thinks of us. So we have three levers, right? We have our positioning, that's who we say that we are, our content, and we have our reputation. So positioning, who we say we are, content, how we communicate that over and over again through content, and then reputation is how other people validate that. They're the different tools at your disposal. The goal for any brand is we want to try and compress those three different levers and align them as closely as possible. So we take them from being far apart to super, super close, so that we're being really, really clear who we are, how we help, who we're for. One of my kind of untested hypotheses that we're working on at the moment is comparison content is something that appears to be working very well in AI, in AEO at the moment. One of my hypotheses for that actually is that's because most brands have a very big gap between these things for reasons that I'm going to go into in a second. These things, it's very easy for them to fall out of sync a little bit. And what you do there is you create room for interpretation. So that's where you create some scope for AI, frankly, to just make it up. You reduce their confidence in who you are, and therefore their willingness to cite you, to recommend you. One thing that our data from our kind of big B2B study showed was AI goes to retrieval when it's not sure and when it needs to be sure. So as it gets towards the bottom of the funnel and intent becomes very decision oriented, that's when it invokes retrieval. The more certainty you can give it, the less likely it is to go looking for answers, because looking for answers is a lot more expensive. So when you have space between these three things, that's uncertainty. That creates opportunities for your competitors to define who you are, for reviews to do more of the work, things like that. When these things are really close together, then you're really clearly communicating who you are and who you should be surfaced to. The challenge I think most brands face is that those three things over time very naturally drift apart, and they drift apart really through good marketing, right? Not through you doing anything particularly wrong. So what most brands that we speak to find is on day one, they decide, okay, this is who we are. So they establish their positioning in a particular point, right? We are the AEO platform for B2B brands, if I take us as an example. And they go producing content and getting reviews that reaffirm that, just as they should do. And then let's say, well, historically, this is kind of thing that happened on a 12-monthly cycle, increasingly a month later, 3 months later, they go and they just tweak that. And they absolutely should do that, right? We should adjust our positioning over time. And they start gathering reviews and producing content that reflects that. And then they do that again a couple more times. And before you know it, a fairly large gap has opened up between who you are now and what some of your content, some of your reviews are saying that you are. That's what we call content depth. It's basically the gap between who you say you are and what some of your content says you are. And for most brands, those two things have drifted apart. And what that essentially is these levers drifting apart. You create more and more uncertainty. So one of the big kind of structural changes that we encourage brands to make is to start looking at their content library in the aggregate an awful lot more, rather than viewing it as a kind of one-to-one optimization job that we're going to produce one piece of content for one query and try and keep matching that up. What you actually want to do is across all of your library, try and make sure that everything is clear, high quality, and consistent. It presents you in the same light. It uses the same key terminology. It establishes you in the same category. It uses broadly similar product descriptions, all aligning with who you are now. Now, if you're building from scratch, that's not that difficult to maintain. But what a lot of brands have done is they've built their library. We work with a brand at the moment that has 10,000 pieces of content that they've built over the course of 10 years, 3 pivots, 4 acquisitions. And it's a huge challenge for them that so much of that content doesn't reflect who they are now, and it's held them back a lot in the AI search space. There are tools, and I'll very briefly touch on how Demand Genius helps with this later, but it's something that AI can help a lot with. One of the biggest things that AI can do that wasn't possible previously is qualitative analysis of content at scale. So whereas before we were able to do quantitative analysis of content, and that's why technical SEO, all of those kind of problems are really solvable now because it's quantitative. It's something that code was really good at working on for us. Qualitative analysis, looking at, okay, this product description, does that match this one on our homepage? Or looking at brand voice alignment, or looking at any number of things. Is this slightly out of date, this reference? Has there been a new study that superseded it? All of this is stuff that historically would have required a human being to read through all of those 10,000 pieces of content and make all of those judgment calls. Not realistic. Now, AI can do that, and that's one of the most, I think, high leverage use cases at the moment for AI when it comes to AEO, much more so than just producing new content. This is also why I do think that it's something to be really careful with. A lot of brands, and we're thinking about like the AEO maturity curve a little bit at the moment. A lot of brands go through very aggressively trying to use AI to churn out a lot more content based on that idea that we have all of these different prompt variations that we now need to try and hit. So let's produce loads of content that does that. But the challenge you have with that is that every time you publish a new piece of content, you take on some content debt, right? So you have one more piece that you need to maintain and you need to constantly analyze and make sure that it's still not drifting too far from who you now are. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't be putting out new content, doesn't mean new content doesn't help. But one thing I do believe quite firmly is that the balance, whereas historically that's been 95-5 in favor of producing new content, it now needs to be a lot closer to 50-50, because we need to think about optimizing our library in the whole. So that's one big thing, and I'll touch shortly on the tangibles of how you do that. The other big recommendation or big takeaway from our research that we have for you is information gain, which is super important. And I think I would make that, or I strongly recommend making that the North Star of your content strategy. Just before I move on, actually, very quickly, John, I'll do another quick spot check.
Yeah, I guess just have you got any particular examples from, say, Demand Genius on content debt and how our positioning has changed?
Yeah, good point. The best example, so yeah, some of our clients, you can see just the scale of it. The best example that I have of a very, very specific instance actually comes to us. So I've learned to be very careful with my words. So in the very early days of Demand Genius, when we first raised our pre-seed funding, I did an interview with a publication called Pre-Seed Now. And in that, he was asking about a product, about our vision, and then he asked about how customers set it up. And foolishly, I said, well, at the moment, it's a manual setup process. So it does, we have to onboard clients, and that does take a bit of time. But one of the things we want to work towards overall, or over time, sorry, is automating that. We've now done that. Setting up Demand Genius for anyone who's watching and wondering is very easy. But that still remains. And imagine I need to reach out to him and see whether there's anything that we can do to kind of tweak that retrospectively. It's difficult because I don't know really that should be true, or that should be the approach that's taken. But that still lingers, and it's still part of our positioning. When you go and ask AI what the drawbacks are of Demand Genius, it will tell you that it takes a little bit of time and it's a manual process to set up. So it's a good example. Obviously, when it's reputational touch points, you only have so much ability to change them, which is why you need to be quite careful with that. Content is a lot more within your control. So if it's something that's on your own site that it's referencing, then that is something that you absolutely can control and need to be. It's a good example of how it lingers. So I think another takeaway from this is to prepare your kind of exec team and make sure that they're quite careful with what they're saying in these interviews, and trying to create a little bit of guidelines around what you do and don't want to risk seeding into these models, because often talking about, okay, we're here and we want to go here, the model doesn't always pick that up. But yeah, that's the most painful example, which is probably why it immediately comes to mind. Cool. Were there any others, or shall I carry on?
No, I mean, we could touch on how long, or are there any ideas on how long the AI models take to update, or how they consider dates? But that might go into very technical.
Yeah, no, I don't have a firm answer for you. It varies depending on where it's coming into its knowledge field. So training data, obviously you have kind of windows where they retrain the models and it takes in fresh content. So that is a slower thing. If something is embedded within the training data, that takes longer to influence. It's not uninfluenceable, but it's a little bit of a black box and I don't have a clear answer. AI can be a very fast channel to influence, certainly much quicker than SEO in terms of that 48% of conversion prompts where it goes and invokes retrieval. You can actually very quickly start showing up and influencing the way that you show up there, because it is going looking for answers. And if those answers are available, and because the queries are much more specific, if you show up for those very specific queries when it does go looking for answers, then it will influence what it presents back. So I think it's a much better channel for early stage companies, small teams, than certainly SEO was, because I think it's not pay to play in quite the same way. The key to doing that is be specific. If you know exactly who you are and what you want to be showing up for, you're going to get less queries coming your direction, but you can influence them quite quickly. But no set is going to take a week, unfortunately. It's not quite that clear. I'm going to carry on now. So in terms of the next big thing that we noticed, and this was really, really borne out in some data that Google just released, is information gain. So I'm going to go back a little bit. So the old role of content, or like how content marketing has always worked, basically at its most core level, is you find a high intent or high volume query that your ICP are entering. You create a piece of content that summarizes knowledge against that query, and the best summary wins, right? That's what search was. That's completely different in today's world, because AI can now answer that query and provide both bespoke summarization of knowledge for any user like that. So if all your content is doing is summarizing knowledge, maybe really effectively, and providing a great kind of 10 things type engaging summary, it's not useful to the AI, and it's not useful to the human over the top of it. your goal is to provide meaningful information gain, right? In order to get cited, your content needs to be citable. There needs to be a real reason why it adds and enhances the model's understanding of you, or if you want humans to find it, then it needs to do something obviously over and above what they can just go and extract themselves from ChatGPT. So we define information gain as net new knowledge that informs AI's understanding and adds additional value to humans. This was a theory even, let's say, a month and a half ago, or we knew it was helpful and a good framework, but we didn't know quite how directly impactful it was. Google's March update very much confirmed this. So they did a big new kind of core update in March, and one of the biggest trends that came out of that was content that features original research saw a 22% boost in visibility. And on the flip side, content that didn't feature any kind of meaningful research or anything like that sort of got quite heavily penalized. So that was one of the most kind of volatile updates that there's ever been that Google's done. And this was the clear, or one of the clear drivers for it. Original research, original data, and it makes perfect sense, right? Is there something in your content that is actually worth citing, that doesn't just sit as latent knowledge within the LLM's training data? If there's not, then there's absolutely no reason for it to do it. There's absolutely no reason for it to attribute that answer or mention your brand at all in that answer. If you've done a study, whether it cites it or not, and we know that citation isn't always necessarily a reason or even the goal, but if you've done an original study, there is a reason for it to surface you as part of its answer to that question. And that's one of the most important, I think, changes and actually roles of humans, I think, in the kind of content landscape that's emerging now. We've developed a framework for this, which I think is really, really useful. And this is one of our biggest recommendations kind of tomorrow, is go and think about how all of your content fits into this framework, where we've created a kind of tiered scoring level that you can go and you can actually use this to assess information gain across your entire site and treat it as a KPI, basically. So at level 0 is no information gain. So that's what the vast majority of content out there, and we've analyzed hundreds of thousands of pieces of content, and I can tell you it is the vast majority of pieces of content out there that are level 0. They summarize or they synthesize existing knowledge. Level 1 is what we call interpretive gain. So that's content that adds a new, interesting interpretation of that knowledge. You can achieve this with AI. It comes back to whether you really understand who you are and you're able to feed a unique perspective into the AI so that it can apply that. What becomes much more powerful and much more impactful is if you can start reaching level 2, which is empirical gain. So actual new data, surveys, things like that, big benchmark studies like we've done, for example, that advance knowledge forward in a way that is kind of eminently citable. And then level 3 is conceptual gain. So this is probably the most uncertain and hardest to achieve, but it's when that data leads to a genuinely new idea or new framework or mental model. I would like to think that Dark AI is a good example of something where we have done original research, produced actual data that you can reproduce that, and there's no reason to think it would show the exact same thing. If it doesn't, then let me know. And it's produced like a concept that we feel has moved forward the industry's understanding of how particularly B2B brands should go about approaching AI as a kind of problem. In every industry, there are going to be areas where there are opportunities for this, but it's the most uncertain, I would say. Not every piece of data is going to be able to produce that. But if you can reach it, conceptual information gain can underpin a brand's positioning for a year, for a decade, well, for a year these days. I think once upon a time for a decade. And the good news that comes out of that is that you do still have a job. I think that's where the role for human marketers comes in a lot more increasingly, is about how we produce that, like the underlying stuff that allows us to produce level 1, 2, and 3 content. We've done a lot of experimenting with AI to understand what we're able to produce within that framework. One thing that's pretty consistent, if we just go down the route of, okay, we prompt AI to give us some content, that produces level 0. There is absolutely nothing in that I can go in and just do in ChatGPT's UI myself, but give it my exact query. So if that's all that we're doing, and this, I think when people are very negative this is what I would call AI slop, right? There's just nothing kind of proprietary about a brand doing that. My demo window in the way. Level 1 is something that you can reach just through AI, but the thing to really focus on is feeding your brand's perspective into it. That's something that a lot of brands aren't really set up to do, that we speak to, right? You need to really understand what's your unique perspective on the market, what's the kind of outlook on the world that makes you a bit different and that allows you to take a slightly different approach to a topic than anyone else. If that's well understood, that's well documented, then you can build workflows that feed that into AI and produce level 1 information game content, which does have a role to play and does produce sometimes citations. What becomes really powerful is if you can then combine that as well with genuine, novel, original research, original data, and then combining that all through AI can produce level 2 and 3. Obviously, I'm always a big proponent of kind of human editing and not just churning it out, but that's something I think everyone has to can make a decision on for themselves. But in terms of the core content, that's kind of what we certainly aim for here at Demand Genius, is to use this to capture some of the efficiencies of AI for sure, but to make sure that we're focusing on particularly these two and having humans do that, and that feeds into our kind of tactical recommendations. So this is probably what everyone is here for. Is I'm going to break up our big kind of takeaways from this into 2 sections, tactical and strategic. So in terms of things that you can do tomorrow, I think the very first thing that I would try and do is, and I know the word audit is probably not everyone's favorite word. It evokes thoughts of accountants and other things that we don't like doing every day. But get a handle on your existing content, or try to understand, okay, across our site, what is the level of information gain, right? Is there a reason across all of our content why AI should be citing us or not? How many of our URLs are out of date? How many are evergreen? How many are current? Again, we know that currency is something that's quite important, and how much of our content is consistent with our new positioning. In the old world, old content that was no longer relevant sat there, it got minimal traffic, and it did no real damage. And that's why we have brands with now 10,000 pieces of content that they don't need. In today's world, that sits there and it gets read by AI, and it informs and often confuses and conflicts with how it wants to present you. And it has a genuine, it causes a problem. So it either needs to be removed or it needs to be updated. So if you can't answer these questions, I would say that's something that we can start doing tomorrow, and we can talk about in a second if that's something that you want us to help with. I would refocus your efforts a little bit in general, kind of on an ongoing basis, rather than just treating this as a project. Can we make it actually a habit where we rebalance our team a little bit? It's going to be different from brand to brand and depending on the stage you are. So at Demand Genius, we're fairly early stage, so we are still a bit more focused on new content. But still, I would say for us, it's 70-30, 80-20 towards new content over maintenance. And if you're a very established brand with 1,000 pieces of content or even more, I think that should be a lot closer to 50-50. And that's a bit of a change that obviously needs to be made at a kind of structural level in terms of the KPIs of the team and things like that. And then the final thing is just in terms of the way that AI currently views you. Try to understand how it perceives you in a lot more detail. So it's very easy to track visibility. It's a little bit harder to really get to grips with how different models perceive your strengths, your weaknesses, your trade-offs, all relative to competitors. But if you can understand that, it's a much more predictive way of understanding how it's going to surface you across all of those dark AI interactions that we spoke about across the whole buyer journey, rather than just in the 16% of interactions where a brand actually gets cited. And then from a strategic point of view, if you're kind of able to influence this, and I know that there are obviously constraints in the real world that a lot of marketers face around headcount and stuff like that at the moment. But if you're able to invest in that original research function, so what on your site is worth citing? There's a kind of idea I really like of content IP, which is what's your kind of unique differentiated thing that you can do in your content. The best example that I know of this is Gong, who are, if you don't know, a sales intelligence company who realized that they sit on an absolute minefield of real world sales call data, and they turned that into Gong Labs. And I would say that was one of their biggest growth drivers for a long time, because it's packed with original insights, even down to finding clear correlations between swearing on a sales call and closing a deal, because it indicates a kind of comfort with each other between the prospect and the seller. And I find that kind of stuff fascinating. But I think most brands are sat on something, maybe not that extreme, and that's where different brands have different unfair advantages in this sense. But I'm sure you can think about something that you can be known for, even if it's more of a survey thing and it's something you have to go out and do rather than just kind of fortunate enough to have already. And spend your time really honing in on the fundamentals. It still shocks me how many brands don't know who they are clearly, don't know who they're for clearly. They don't really understand when and how they win. Specificity is super important, and almost not getting greedy. So if you can't answer those questions and do it honestly, it's not a good time to be if your goal is to be visible, influence, whatever you want to achieve through AI, the best example I can give you is in the CRM category. You aren't going to make it think within the next 3 months that you're the best CRM, not even within the next 3 years, probably. But you can convince it that you're the best CRM for these specific groups of people and specific use cases. So really looking at yourself and understanding those fundamentals is one of the most important things, and then get that documented so that humans understand it, which I think is long-standing best practices. But also so that AI, it can really, really easily feed AI systems, produce kind of markdown format documents that you can produce as really narrow context into an AI, and you will find that the quality of every output that you get from it multiplies massively. I'll pause there quickly before I maybe spend 2 minutes on how Demand Genius can help you with all of this. John, I don't know if we had any other questions or...
Yeah, just got a question on kind of tracking and what are some key metrics and some KPIs that you can report to if asked, how are we doing in AI search? And there's a number wanted or a set of numbers wanted. Are there any good metrics to consider that maybe perhaps a lot of brands aren't actually considering?
Yeah, so, and yeah, it's a good question actually. Because I think what most brands do is they kind of show visibility metrics, and then they can probably attribute a certain amount of revenue to AI. But remember that very, very few brands are going to click through specifically from AI, because if we're only cited in 16%, if we're only cited 16% of the time, think how many times people click through that. So your traffic, and therefore ultimately all of the attribution that's built on a kind of direct attribution of a hit on the website through to you, is going to tell this minuscule picture of the actual impact that AI is having. I think the best route, and we're still improving this and trying to understand what the best ways are. The best thing that we've identified is to map your perceived strengths and weaknesses to the different buyers in your buying group. And I will show you this in a product screenshot actually, because it's the best way to illustrate this. So this is something that we recently launched within the platform, where we can actually quantify that and make it visually something that you can report on. So what we do, and you can do this yourself, so you by no means have to use Demand Genius to use this, understand who the different stakeholders are on your buying committee, and understand what all of the different criteria that stakeholders might want to assess your product on, or the criteria that are important in your category. You can then talk to AI and you can understand, you can run sentiment analysis and understand, okay, does it think that we're easy to use? Does it think that we're customizable? Does it think that we integrate well? So on and so forth. And you can map that to the different, to what's important to each buyer, to actually get a much more predictive sense of, okay, ignoring the specific prompt, ignoring all of the specifics of what they asked. If I'm a CTO and I go talking to AI about Demand Genius, what is it going to tell me? And you might not get the exact response. You might not know whether you're cited, but you will start to understand, okay, it's going to say this and this, and that stuff which you need to then make sure that your sales team understand. That stuff because it's going to influence at every point. That's the perception that until you can correct it from a marketing point of view is embedded. So that's one, like, I suppose, exercise, and we can quantify that as well. It's not as simple as one metric, but we can kind of put that into alignment percentages and stuff like that. The other thing at a more basic level that I encourage everyone to do is just if we do look at basic visibility tracking, take a slightly broader view of it. So what most tools and brands do is they just they basically count the number of mentions or citations of the brand in responses. But what that doesn't show you is all of those awareness and consideration stage prompts that don't mention a brand. But what you can do is you can start configuring what we call custom entities. So if you think of a brand's name as an entity that we can pick out in a response to say, yes, you were mentioned, it doesn't have to just be your brand name. It can also be your products, your key terminology, your thought leaders. So in our example, we might we might want to say that Tom Rudnai is being quoted every so often in AI. Even more important, we might want content depth, and we might want dark AI, and we want to see whether that is starting to influence industry narratives. So that's a much better indication, because those kinds of things are going to come up further up the funnel. So you can take a broader view of what entities being mentioned are good for you. And I guess that feeds me quite nicely into our how we can help. So that's the kind of thing that Demand Genius does for you out of the box. We allow you to configure all of the different entities that you want to pick out, visualize therefore how your visibility varies at each stage of a complex funnel, map that to different stakeholders. And then on the content side of things, in terms of how we actually act on that, build an army of AI agents that are constantly assessing things like information gain, content quality, currency, consistency across all of your content, and surfacing to you exactly where there's an update needed, so that you can kind of put the content maintenance part that we said needs to be more 50-50 part of your focus, put that on autopilot, and essentially have AI agents operating that for you all of the time. And then finally, this is actually what we did before this actually is connect that all through to revenue. So all of that visibility, and get back to the point of what you should report on, ultimately revenue, and how AI is contributing to that at every point. And that's something that Demand Genius kind of connects through out of the box. So a bit of a pluggy response, but it seemed to fit what I was going to talk about. Cool, and that is everything that I had to run through. I think we are at time, so I will stop sharing my screen. I don't know if there's anything else to go through, but if not, then I think we can probably leave it there.
Yeah, I guess just we haven't got any more questions in the chat, but as a next stage, if people want to try out Demand Genius or have a demo of the software and more info, what should they do?
Yeah, of course, and that's the very final step. Book a demo, head to the site. You can try it out for free. You can book a demo and have the pleasure of another 25-minute conversation with me, where I'll take you through it all. Happy to also kind of get into doing a bit of an analysis of your current AI performance, visibility, and content depth. One thing we are just launching is a bit more of a managed service on this. So if you're looking at this like, okay, Tom, that all sounds like an awful lot of work, we can deliver this for you, and we will do it. It tends to work out about 25-30% of the cost of an agency. So if you'd like to do this but don't have the time, then do let me know as well, and it's something that we can take you through. But hopefully, independent of that, this has been a good use of 46 minutes of your day. Cool. Fantastic. Well, on that note, then.
Yeah, just to say, we'll send out the slides, and any relevant links as well as a follow-up.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.